Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat? Clearly, one of the biggest, if not the biggest question the Saints will have this offseason is who's going to play quarterback in 2023 and beyond. Jameis Winston most certainly will not be back. They're not going to pay him the cash sum that they would owe him in salary if he were on the roster. He's going to be cut. Andy Dalton is a free agent. They could certainly re-sign Andy Dalton. We'll see how that may transpire. But the Saints will also no doubt kick the tires on free agents around the league and what other players might be available, and then pursue draft options as well. We learned last week that Derek Carr, with it's pretty certain, we learned before the end of the regular season, that Derek Carr was not going to be back in Las Vegas. The Raiders are going to move on. The problem with Derek Carr is he's got this massive contract that many would view as untradeable. And that is what Mike Garafolo talked about on Good Morning Football earlier this week.
Right now, sources continue to say that Carr does not have permission to speak to other teams. Now, theoretically, he would if the Raiders agreed to compensation with the team, but that has not occurred to this point. So Carr has about 9 days to go. It's February 15th before there is a trigger of a $40 million guarantee. The thought is that the Raiders, if they don't have a trade partner by then, would release Carr. He'd become a free agent, and as he put it over the weekend, we'd be able to, quote, speak to all of my friends, which would mean he'd be able to talk to every team. So until and unless the Raiders give him permission, Jamie, to speak to another team, it appears that a trade before that February 15th deadline appears to be a low percentage possibility.
Okay, so that was Monday. How much has changed in 48 hours? Again, on Tuesday evening, we learned from Nick Underhill of NewOrleans.football that Carr was going to make a visit to New Orleans, and Carr is in New Orleans today visiting with the New Orleans Saints. As you heard Garafolo report that Carr was not going to be allowed to make visits, because remember, he's still under contract with the Raiders. He was not going to be allowed by the Raiders to make visits unless the team he was visiting had agreed to trade compensation. So Ian Rappaport picks up there. Ian Rappaport, guest on the Pat McAfee show today, spelled it out. Saints appear to be the front runners right now.
First of all, I do not believe a trade has been agreed to. My understanding of the situation is he was only going to be allowed to speak or visit, like he's on a visit right now, actually, in New Orleans, if a team was willing to give the compensation that it would take to do a trade. So I don't think they're like, all right, we're good, but it's like, all right, I would do this. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, they're in the ballpark. No. I'm just telling you guys, it's not like, all right, I know the pick, here's what it is. It's like, well, yeah, this is kind of the range, but might the pick change? Like, let's say he does adjust his contract, right? Let's say he goes to New Orleans and decides, all right, well, I'll actually take this. Maybe the pick is worth something different. Maybe the Raiders go, actually, we could pay this, and then the pick. So, like, I'm not saying it's agreed to, but obviously the Saints are the front runner for Derek Carr.
Got it.
That is real. So,
Saints front runner for Derek Carr, that would make sense because he's visiting. So there would have had to at least been some conversation about draft capital. I'm just setting the stage here, and I'm going to circle back and I'm going to give you my opinion because I think the Saints are teetering on a debilitating decision if they go down this path. We'll get to that in a second. But Rappaport lays out the path for the Saints to make a trade for Derek Carr. Remember, if the Raiders cut Derek Carr, he's a free agent. He can sign anywhere he wants. If you are the Saints and you want to make sure that he doesn't sign anywhere else, you trade for him. Now, he has no trade clause, but he presumably here would be open to a trade to New Orleans because he's making this visit. Why else would he fly here and take this visit if he wasn't at least open to the possibility? So here's Rappaport on the path for the Saints to trade for Carr.
So there is an opportunity here to lock in the money and for the Saints to be like, we have a guy. That's why this is kind of there's a push-pull on both sides.
But they had to have an agreement with the Raiders. Like, if we end up not having to pay the money, you'll be able to give us lower mid. If you do, we'll give you this. Like, they had to have that conversation. Pretty much foregone conclusion. If the Saints and Derek Carr's people are able to figure out the contract,
trade will happen.
Trade will happen.
Yes.
Okay. If they can figure out the money, now let's go there. What could stop a deal between the Saints and the Raiders for Derek Carr?
It is a place that would make a ton of sense for him. And Dennis Allen's there, was his head coach in Oakland. And the relationship has been good. And They are speaking today. They've had communication. Like, it's all good. The question, though, is this. Let's say Derek Carr agrees to a trade with the Saints today. He gets his contract, he gets his guaranteed money. If he says, you know what, cool, but I don't want to weaken the team that I'm going to by them giving up a pick, I'm just going to sign with them in free agency. What if the Saints go, yeah, we're just going to go get someone else, or we're going to wait for someone else, or he doesn't get the money that would be available now because the Saints would be willing to pay him more, and they're like, well, if we can't lock you in, we're just going to open it up to everyone.
Okay. Let's unpack this a little bit. So Rappaport laid it all out there. Essentially, whenever later this month, Carr's contract becomes guaranteed. The Raiders are not going to let that happen. They're not going to owe Derek Carr on February 15th $40.4 million. They are either going to trade him before that date, or if they can't find a trade partner, they're going to cut him. They're going to cut him, and they'll absorb dead money on the deal, which is far less than that $40.5 million. So if they cut him, they'll take on $5.6 million in a salary cap hit, but they'll free up nearly $30 million. Again, so that's the options for the Raiders. Find a trading partner. If you don't, you cut him. So if you're a team like the Saints, you have two options. You say, we could trade for him and guarantee he comes here, or wait for the Raiders to cut him and then sign him to a lesser deal. Now, part of what Rappaport said there is true. Maybe the Saints work out some deal with the Raiders to restructure Carr's contract. If Carr agrees to a reworked deal, maybe the Raiders take on more money of it. It lessens the cap blow for the Saints. Maybe they extend him, spread the money out over years, which we've seen. I guess my point is they can make it work. But the Saints are already $55 million over the 2023 salary cap. They are going to have to do the thing, again, they do every year, which is rework deals, take salary and convert it to a signing bonus and spread that bonus out over years and take on, phantom years on the back end of a contract to spread the money out, and you have dudes on the books that aren't even playing for a half decade. But that's how the Saints have gotten into this mess. And I want to reiterate, I was okay with that strategy when they were pushing to win a Super Bowl with Drew Brees and Sean Payton. And you felt like any given year you could break through. And if you had broken through and won a Super Bowl, none of us would care because you'd have the Lombardi. It didn't work out. So now you're saddled with all this debt and a lot of wins to show for it, but no championships. The question you have to ask yourself if you're the New Orleans Saints is, does Derek Carr put you over the top? Are you a Super Bowl contending team with Derek Carr? As you are today, are you a Super Bowl contending team with Derek Carr? And if you believe that Derek Carr coming to New Orleans makes this team from a 7-10 football team to an 11, 12, 13 win team that's pushing to win the NFC and going to the Super Bowl, I think you're high. Because 32-year-old Derek Carr is a better option than 35-year-old Andy Dalton. Make no mistake of it. 32-year-old Derek Carr, which is what he is today, is a better option than 35-year-old Andy Dalton. But I've heard too much of, hey, Derek Carr in a different spot could be like Drew Brees when he came to the Saints. No. 2006 Drew Brees was 25 years old. He was entering his prime. Yes, he had the shoulder injury, but everything else with Drew Brees was you had a decade. You knew if the shoulder was right and they were confident it was, you had a decade. You ended up having 16 years. But you had a decade with him. He was 25. Carr's been in the league for 9 years. Derek Carr today is more like what Andy Dalton was 3 years ago when Cincinnati kicked him to the curb. Let me spell this out for you. Andy Dalton's last year in Cincinnati was 2019. I don't want to bore you with a lot of numbers, so you don't have to memorize this. There's not a test. Just understand the comparison between the two. Andy Dalton in 2019, as a 32-year-old, Derek Carr, basically the same point in their career, 9 years in. He threw for 3,494 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 14 picks. That was his last year in Cincy. So basically, he was 6 yards short of 3,500. 16 touchdowns, 14 picks. Derek Carr this year in Las Vegas, 35-22. So he threw for, I'm so bad at math. He threw for 28 more yards. Derek Carr this year threw for 28 more yards than Andy Dalton did his last year in Cincinnati. He threw for 24 touchdowns, which is 8 more touchdowns, but 14 interceptions, the exact same number of picks. Derek Carr today is Andy Dalton when he was his last year in Cincinnati. He's a guy in his 30s who's past his prime. He's still a top 15, maybe top inside of that 10 to 15 range quarterback in the NFL. No one's going to mistake him for Burrow or Allen or Mahomes or Herbert or Jalen Hurts. Like, he's not elite. He's not in the upper tier. He's a top half of the quarterbacks in the NFL type guy. But you're not winning a Super Bowl with Derek Carr and this Saints team. You're not. Like, convince me otherwise. Your defensive line took a gigantic step back. You've got aging safeties right now as well. I think you're going to be good at cornerback. You're about to have an offensive line shuffle. Andrus Pete's going to be a cap casualty. What do you do with Eric McCoy? We're about to find out. James Hurst isn't your franchise left tackle. Where does Trevor Pennick fit? We're going to find out. You are a disaster at running back right now to where in the end of the season, you're giving carries to Eno Benjamin and David Johnson. Alvin Kamara very well could miss time next year because of the incident in Las Vegas. And you're trying, and by the way, Michael Thomas is about to be gone. You're probably not going to re-sign Jarvis Landry. You mean to tell me that Derek Carr and this Saints team are going to the Super Bowl? You're insane. You are insane. And what's more, if you trade for Derek Carr, you are giving up assets. You are going to have to give the Raiders draft capital. Maybe it's a day 3 pick. I don't know. Maybe it's like a 6th rounder. I don't care. To give the Raiders anything for Derek Carr, for the right to take on that contract of a 32-year-old is insane. There is no justification for it. But if you're Dennis Allen right now, you're getting the 2014 Raiders band back together. You're bringing back your old DC. You're bringing back your old secondaries coach, the quarterback you drafted back in 2014, who's now at the end of his career. This doesn't make any sense. It further solidifies in my mind. If the Saints do this, and again, the Raiders would not have allowed Derek Carr to come on a visit if they were not confident the Saints would be willing to execute a trade for Derek Carr. But if the Saints make a trade for Derek Carr and give assets to the Raiders for a 32-year-old quarterback that's past his prime, and they're willing to take on that contract, this would be the worst decision the New Orleans Saints have made since Mike Ditka traded an entire draft, plus a one next year, the following year, for Ricky Williams. It would be the worst decision, and there's been a lot of them. There have been a lot of bad decisions. But considering where you are as a franchise, where you are against the cap, what you need to improve, if you take on that contract for an aging player and give up assets to do it, it would be the worst decision the New Orleans Saints will have made since the Ricky Williams trade. God help you all if the Saints trade for Derek Carr. Because if they trade for Derek Carr, I'm going to do the whole red face, high pitch, scream and squeal and rant thing that some of you think is funny and some of you hate. So maybe some of you will love it. Paulie, get the thumbnail ready for YouTube. Smoke coming out of my ears, flames coming off my head. We'll see whatever creative route Paulie goes next. Subscribe up to the AFR YouTube channel. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.